Well, welcome Senator Susie McDonald, a friend and a friend of Northern Australia, to the Knack on Australia podcast.
Oh, so great to be with you, Dan, and I know that you too are a great friend of Northern Australia. So, that's
Yes,
made me heaven this morning.
know it well. Hey, one of the main reasons I thought it would be important to get you on is to discuss the crisis in Australia's metals manufacturing and smelting sector. There are estimates about that over 70,000 jobs Australia-wide and 17,000 in North Queensland alone are at risk. For those who are not familiar with the issue, can you give some idea about the scale of the problem?
Yeah. So you've framed it up so well because over generations, over probably the last 150 years, Australia has established itself as being a great primary industries nation. Now, this doesn't sit with everybody who wants us to be something else, but we are genuinely world leading in mining, in agriculture. But let's talk about the mining side today. It was during particularly the turn of the last century that giants of our industries, people like W.S. Robinson and others, identified that it wasn't just enough to mine. We needed to also be in the metals manufacturing space as well, not only to be a great trading partner, but to be a dependable ally. That's an important thing to remember as we move on this discussion, because, of course, the world has got no less secure than it was in that period. We are now at this crazy juncture where we are looking at both industry and government being asleep at the wheel, I believe. We have had some companies embracing a future that doesn't exist, a technology that doesn't yet exist. It's driving up their costs of production. At the same time as world players are leaping into the space. China has built 6 new copper refineries. We know what's happened in Indonesia with nickel. Right around the world, other economies are identifying that metals manufacturing is so critically important, whether it be in our traditional metals, steel, or even into rare earths and those, battery metals. So, you know, this is why it's important for Australia. It's important for us economically. It's important for us for our defence of the region and for our allies. And it's also important on a really fundamental level for Northern Australia. This is the place where we have some of these great activities, where we have the great people and communities that we need in order to continue to grow and have Australia be more prosperous.
Yeah. So it's across the country, as you mentioned, with this issues in Mount Isa with the copper smelting there, but there's also aluminium smelters in New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, and then lead and zinc in other parts of the country. Can these smelters and can manufacturing more generally survive as long as we continue with our net zero and carbon reduction commitments?
Well, I'm a great believer in technology and the way that Australia has always been able to um, be incredibly innovative, particularly in its resources space. So I have no doubt that as the world's demands um, for change products continue, that we will be able to meet them, but not in the time frame that has been driven, particularly by the Albanese government, but also by some of these companies. Now, I don't group what's happening with copper into that same space, but certainly what we've seen in aluminium and in some of the zinc smelters and refineries, that is certainly playing a big part, is a drive towards trying to meet emissions targets that we just don't have the technology or the capability to do that. And all that does instead is drive up the costs of production, which makes us uncompetitive against other jurisdictions that are not doing the same. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that India, um, China, um, the US all have their own emissions targets, but they've all agreed, or they've all decided in their own economies that they will meet them at a time that is in the best interests of their people. And I think that's the number one thing that we're considering at the moment is, You've already touched on the thousands of jobs across Australia that will be impacted, and there is no replacement. There is no replacement for the well-paid jobs that these people and families enjoy. This is a real crisis for Australian prosperity, and one that I think we should be giving great attention to.
What's the reason why it's come to a head at the moment? Is it because of the overly ambitious commitments, or are there other reasons and factors at play?
It's a perfect storm, I believe. We have escalating costs of electricity, and certainly if we just look at Mount Isa, the copper refiner, the copper smelter, and then the refinery in Townsville, the escalation of costs of electricity has really been incredibly difficult for that business to manage. And I know that as they look at their mining assets around the world, they have looked at Australia and said, well, you're a smart country. You'll be able to manage through this, but it doesn't look like we've been able to do it in a timely manner. At the same time, though, we're seeing new smelters and refineries being built in China, in Riyadh, right around the world. Other jurisdictions know that it is so critically important to have copper, whether it be the 90 kilograms on average that goes into a house, whether it be into munitions and defence elements. Copper is a critical element. And during the last election, I took forward a policy for the coalition that we make copper a critical mineral, because it would have achieved a couple of things. And just to keep the conversation broad, Dan, I also had added a bauxite, alumina, and aluminium, and zinc to that list, amongst some other elements. Because what that would do is it would allow those industries to access the Critical Minerals Fund, as well as the manufacturing grants that the government is making available. These are all important to allow our industries to remain competitive in a world that is seeking to do the same things that we should be doing, which is increase their capacity in mining and in metals manufacturing and in the important supply chains for modern technology.
Yeah. I mean, in an ideal world, you wouldn't need to throw government funds at these smelters to keep them afloat, would you? Right. I'm just wondering, even if we abandoned all carbon emissions commitments tomorrow, which is politically, I can't see that happening. But would that be enough to save these smelters? Because isn't a reassessment of our trade policy at some level also required? According to the terms of the agreement we have with China, we can import 100% of their manufacturing goods, including metal processing product, duty free. Can we ever hope to have a metals smelting processing industry, or indeed any serious manufacturing industry in Australia, as long as that continues?
Well, it's a good question. I think to your points first about if net zero targets would drop tomorrow, no, that wouldn't. That this has been a long time in the happening, particularly privatised electricity generation in other states. In Queensland, we've had a generation of a Labor government who has, instead of having electricity generated at the lowest possible price, as it was designed to be, they've generated electricity at the best dividend to government. So Australia's costs are really a very big issue. Um, the other thing is that as capacity comes on offshore, it's made Australia less competitive. So I do believe that there is a place for government intervention in this regard. And look, it's not unusual. If you think back to 1915, when the Australian government or the Queensland government, both state and federal, were providing assistance to build the necessary infrastructure, rail, water, roads, in order to get minerals out of the ground into smelters. In 1939, we were converting smelters from lead to copper in the case of Mount Isa. I'm sure there are other examples, because we identified that that was important to Australia's competitiveness in the war effort. So, it is a perfect storm for Australia, and that is why it is all hands to the pump. We need to be getting the federal government to be standing shoulder to shoulder with industry, with state governments, but most importantly with Australia Inc. About ensuring that we remain prosperous into the future.
How do you think it plays out, Susie? I know you're not obviously not in government, so you're not privy to some of the conversations that are
Mm.
being had by the responsible ministers. But i- is it likely that some of these smelters close, or that's likely that some of the government takes a partial stake, or takes them over entirely to keep them operational? What's
Mm.
likely to occur?
Well, I think it is impossible to force a company to continue operating when they're losing hundreds of millions of dollars. That is,
Mm,
that's not the world we live in. So, what are our other options? Well, I do think a government involvement, but I also think that it means Australians will expect management direction, or at least the direction of other businesses, so that it is not seen as the government funding one particular company.
yeah.
I would really love to see some of the expertise of the broader industry brought in to match any government investment, so that you'd end up with a board that had, uh, other expertise from other companies, so that you weren't just, in addition to there being some sort of equity stake in whether it be a smelter or a refinery. I think that's only fair. Whether or not
Mm.
there's a pathway for a buyback, or some other public involvement later, that's something that should be considered. So I don't think that it should be specific bailouts of individual companies if there's not some right of return for Australia, in addition to the jobs that are maintained. So I think that's an important first step. Um, the second part of what you were asking, I have just lost.
Well, let's move on to a related topic. I mean, we currently have about 5% of our economy, which is characterized as being involved in the manufacturing sector. If mineral processing and smelting disappears, it could happen if there's no, like you say, government rescue package of some description. That percentage of our economy will drop to like 2 or 3%, back of the envelope calculation. I mean, that's sub-Saharan levels of economic complexity, and well below peer middle powers that we compare ourselves to. Um, how does it end? Because initially we were told that you know we can't build cars here, um, and then we were told it's cheaper to import them, but now we've reached a situation where we can't produce paper, we can't produce glass, we can't produce soon any sort of refined metals. How does the story end? Like, do we end up being satisfied with only being an exporter of primary produce? So how can that story be turned around?
Well, there's a few elements to that, aren't there? And the things that make us competitive in manufacturing are the big input costs: electricity, energy, wages. Now, Australia has long prided itself on paying people fairly, and so I think that's something that as Australians we expect. I'm not sure that the government's industrial relations program now is still in the realms of fair pay, or if we're getting into something else. So let's just set that aside for the moment.
Mm,
But the input elements of electricity and energy is something that I think we have taken for granted. Gas in particular. So the great manufacturing states of Australia, in Victoria in particular, and New South Wales, have really been let down by the state Victorian decision not to have onshore gas production. This is a shocking element, and it's meant that those big demands for manufacturing gas have really gone out of the system, and we're now relying on bringing forward Queensland CSG gas. I mean, I think it's ironic that the sort of gas that we develop in Queensland, they're very happy to receive in a pipe, but they won't develop their own in that state.
mm,
In fact, they're now talking about turning off the gas to regional towns, which means that families who have been able to rely on affordable gas to run their cooktop or their hot water system, or warm their home, are now going to be forced back into that incredibly expensive electricity grid. So that's a real fail. But those inputs into what makes manufacturing possible in Australia is something that we stopped focusing on. And in the last 3 years, I've tried very hard as the Shadow Minister for Resources to work with my counterpart, Minister for Resources, to hold hands, to say, we will come with you on whatever it is to develop more gas, both onshore and offshore, and to ensure that we are able to develop our huge, huge resources in this country.
Mm.
But instead, Labor has done deals with the Greens. They have really done everything they can to make the inputs into manufacturing in Australia shorter, more expensive, tighter. They've damaged our world credibility by following the 1980s Argentina version of a gas market intervention. And we know what happened to Argentina, a country very similar to Australia, rich in resources, but became so poor because they turned their backs on both investment in gas, in mining, and of course in their successful beef industry. So they're now clawing their way back from it. That's where it ends for Australia. That's where it ends, is that we are Argentina in 30 years' time.
Mm. There was a gas reservation policy put out by the coalition in the lead up to the last federal election here in Australia. I think that was poorly understood, and I mean, I even saw an interview, I think, with John Howard, where he sort of uncharacteristically was unable to sort of articulate what it was. What were you driving at there, and what more can be done to boost the gas industry here in Australia?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is that investors, whether it be into gas, copper, aluminium, bauxite, any of our resources sectors, need to have confidence that the government is going to support them. And so we took a very broad policy forward where we were going to halve approval times by aligning state and federal approval processes. Very, very simple.
Mm.
We were going to defund the most activist of the activist organisations who were not interested in Australia developing its resources, but in fact achieving what they're going very close to doing, which is shutting down investment in mining, in gas, and in metals manufacturing. So, we wanted to stop that happening. We wanted to release more offshore acreage so that more gas was available to Australians, and particularly in the places like the Bass Strait and offshore Victoria, that would have come directly into the domestic market, because we know that more supply satisfying the demand, and in fact a growing demand for gas in Australia. We know that it will more than double by 2040, that we would then see prices come down as well. Now, we had been working with industry to try and bridge that gap, and that had been happening relatively successfully under the coalition up until 2022, that the Energy Minister and Resources Minister and Treasurer were able to jointly sit down with industry and be able to negotiate enough supply to the domestic market. Now, once the new Energy Minister came in, having made some pretty bold statements about not supporting gas, about profiteering from the Ukraine conflict, a number of other things, it's probably no surprise that he was unable to have the same sort of relationship with the gas industry. And what we saw was a greater reluctance to turn gas into the less profitable part of the domestic market. And whilst we saw, I should flag, there are some companies, some exporters who do a very, very good job of exporting a significant percentage of their production into the domestic market, but there are others that don't, and in fact that buy gas from the domestic market. Now, that's not acceptable, and we had been working with industry, with the gas industry, to try and bring more gas, to make more gas available to the domestic market. So at the
Mm.
same time as encouraging the development of the Beetaloo in the Northern Territory, the Northwest Shelf in Western Australia, and the Taroom region, the Roma region, Surat basins in Queensland, we were very keen to see more gas come to market, but in the short term, we needed industry to come together to find a solution to that. In the absence of industry coming forward with that solution, we felt we had no choice but to push towards a domestic reservation. It's not a perfect solution, and I would have hoped it would not be a long-term solution, but it is significant to understand that the only way we move forward is by producing more gas, gas that meets our domestic demands for manufacturing, for households, as well as the demand for our allies. We know that Japan wants to increase its gas take by 60%. This is huge. Australia should be benefiting from that in the royalties, in the PRRT taxes, in the well-paid jobs that flow through into our economy, and of
Mm.
course the gas that goes into manufacturing, whether it be polythene pipe or chemicals, glass, there is plastics manufacturing, um, and in the case of the smelter in Mount Isa, affordable gas, affordable electricity for that smelter, which then allows them to manufacture sulfuric acid, which allows the fertilizer manufacturer just down the road to also operate, the last manufacturer in Australia for fertilizers. So
Mm.
this is why they're all interlinked. And I'm afraid that in the last 3 years, we've seen the Albanese government be completely, you know, um, uh, blind and deaf to the very practical realities of we need more gas and gas fast. We need more support for our mining endeavours. We need encouraging signals sent to our investors, and we need to back in our metals manufacturing industry so that we have some manufacturing left in this country, because as we've already discussed, we have seen what happens when we don't do that, and it's a very poor society. We don't get the benefits that we should otherwise be achieving here, because it is a very competitive world. Investment dollars are flooding into other jurisdictions where they're seeing those kind of positive signals for investment.
They are. How do you um, tackle the green stuff or deal with the green stuff and have a viable resources and manufacturing sector? The Prime Minister, on his recent trip to China, attended a meeting with Australian iron ore producers and Chinese steelmakers where he talked up the potential of so-called green steel. Executive director and founder of Fortescue, Twiggy Forrest, had a recent article in Australian where he talked about China being a key climate ally. What's your view on green steel?
Well, green steel, as it stands, is a fantasy.
Mm.
It is a long way off to be able to produce steel using a technology that would take water. You split a water molecule in order to produce green steel, and you do it by using renewable energy. So it's at great cost, great energy cost, as well as great economic cost, to produce something that we're already producing right now, very economically. Uh, Australian coal, Australian met coal, is incredibly high calorific value. We have technology that is being used, unfortunately not in Australia, but in Japan, in China, and no doubt in other parts of the world. We have high energy, low emissions use of coal. So we can absolutely be making steel using coal, using iron ore, in the technology that we know, we understand, and it's very affordable. And I think that there is I was speaking to somebody one day about a metric that they want to design that measures how much steel, how many kilograms of steel is used per person in an economy, as a way of
Mm.
demonstrating the prosperousness of that economy.
Mm.
And it's true, whether it's steel in high-rise buildings for residential, steel into factories, because as we know, if something's not made of steel, it's made in a factory made of steel.
Mm.
That these are that would be a great metric for how an economy is doing. Anyway,
Mm.
green steel is not coming to us anytime soon. Green hydrogen, is a technology that is not developed enough for us to be adopting it as a pathway to emissions reduction. And again, I would just come back and flag, in a country that is very dry and has limited water, the idea that we're going to use desalinators to take seawater, to use those molecules to make um, green hydrogen is it just doesn't make sense.
Mm,
So, a bit of crazy talk. And of course, China is an interesting economy. Their demand for energy and electricity is enormous. And the big drives of that is their manufacturing of solar panels and wind turbines, which of course they use themselves and export to the rest of the world,
mm,
as well as AI and the electrification of their own grids. When I was
mm,
there last, they were building double stacked fast freight trains in addition to
mm,
fast commuter trains. And so where they're going with their use of hydro technology, hydroelectricity, in amongst new coal-fired power stations, new nuclear power stations, as well as everything else, means that they will potentially get to a point in the 2070s. I'm not an expert in energy, but in the future where they will be able to decarbonise very quickly. But that is not now. It is not in your or my lifetimes, Dan, because they understand, as well as everybody else in the world, that we must use the existing technology in order to build the things that are necessary for our economies to remain competitive, to keep our Australian people who are alive now, not in 50 years' time,
mm,
to keep them prosperous and able to live the lives, have the healthcare and the education that they enjoy. These are all important parts of the Australian economy, which I think China understands. I think India understands. I know the US understands. But Australia, we are charging down a route of renewables only, and it will not work.
As you alluded to before, I mean, there's a national security component to manufacturing. More industrialized countries tend to beat less industrialized countries if it ever came to a conflict. So we are now very deindustrialized. Not a happy situation. Uh, how to address this? I mean, I read an article the other day where Ryan Stokes of the Seven Group, he floated the idea of some type of green tariff, saying that if we're going to be purer than thou in the carbon zero technologies order in Australia, then there has to be some way of equalizing that. You can't just be importing stuff from other countries that don't have the same commitment. What do you think of that idea?
Look, I think that is an interesting part of the mix, and we do import a lot of manufactured goods. So, I think that's probably a good idea. I'm more concerned about our own green tariff, which is the safeguards mechanism, which Labor has now made so expensive that there are mines who are now going to have to pay a tax in the form of the safeguards mechanism because there isn't the technology available domestically in order for them to hook into the grid. There might be a greenfield site, which means that they are penalised for trying to bring online the sort of mining that we need in this country. And then, of course, existing coal mines who still, in large part, keep the lights on for Australia. Those mines are now saying to me, we've got a choice to make. Do we pay a tax, or do we keep mining the coal that goes into the domestic supply right here in Newcastle or Sydney, or do we just tap out?
Mm,
That's a really concerning decision that we are forcing companies to have to consider. And again, so this is having a green tariff on our Australian businesses. I think we have to get back to some of the basics about what is it that Australia wants to achieve. I mean, in World War II, we were manufacturing an Australian fighter, the Boomerang plane.
mm,
I think that played a large part in the decision to bring on the Bell Bay aluminium refinery,
mm,
because we understood we needed alumina and aluminium. We didn't even have bauxite mines at that stage. We were bringing in bauxite from New Guinea
yeah,
and other places. I mean,
yeah,
isn't that fascinating? That's
mm,
the foresight that we had then. We'd
mm,
just been through a world war. We're very focused on what supply chains look like. And here we are, 80 years later. We're going to celebrate victory in the Pacific this week in Townsville, and yet seemingly our federal government has walked away from any understanding of the importance of supply chains, manufacturing, industrialisations in this country.
Mm. There's a big divide in Australia, as you well know, between the attitude of in the regions and inner city, capital cities. And I always say to people, at the towns, when the Cowboys play in Townsville, there's a promotion that goes over the airwaves, digging coal and kicking goals.
Yeah.
But people cheer, great stuff. But I can't see that sort of being promoted over the MCG speakers and get quite the same reaction. How do you bridge the divide between the attitudes of regional Australia and the capital cities?
It's a terrific question, and of course all of Australia is turning its mind to that. Brisbane is the biggest FIFO town in Queensland, and yet in the Brisbane city, I'm not sure that there is a good understanding of the energy discussion, of the economics of who pays the bills. And it is, to be clear, it is iron ore, gas, coal, and sneaking up gold. But it is mining. It is mining that pays the bills. And so whatever we can do to support those sectors is really important. The communities always feel I don't like the idea of going around and educating people. That seems not a very successful way to win hearts and minds. But we do need to win hearts and minds so that young Australians, city Australians, understand that in a very practical sense, it is mining, it is manufacturing. They're the things that pay the taxes and the bills. And if I could just make this point, labour this point. Last year we had $42.5 billion paid in corporate taxes, not royalties, not PAYG taxes, but taxes paid out of the mining sector to Australia. That was the equivalent of the entire Medicare budget. And out of the gas sector, from royalties and corporate taxes, they paid the equivalent of the PBS. Really significant, important public expenditure programs in this country. Now, come 40 year, because of the increased costs of production, because of reduced commodity prices, the mining sector will pay only $32.5 billion in taxes. So this is government policy that is driving up the cost of production. That means that we will receive less taxes with a lesser capability to pay for Medicare, for the PBS, for other great programs that Australians rely on. That is the piece that I think as governments have to make a choice. Do they take on greater debt, which of course means that there is greater interest payments for the economy? That is what we miss out on, or we have to cut those programs altogether. That's a very live issue. I do know that there are a significant number of Australians. I think the latest surveys is about 51% of Australians feel that we need to take climate action urgently and immediately. I think that prosperous countries can take action on good economies and good environments. That's what it takes. Poor countries can't do that. And I don't think we are giving a true choice to Australians about what decision, when they're voting for the Greens or they're saying to Labor, we want urgent climate action, that we are truly explaining to them the choice that they are making. And that is up to the coalition. That is part of the energy group that I'm part of, that Dan Tian's leading. That is our responsibility, is to be able to say to Australians, this is the choice that you are making. Just need you to understand that, so that then you can say, okay, I'm okay that we are less economically capable to make the sort of changes that you might want to make if we don't do what is world-leading mining and processing in this country.
Mm.
We should be incredibly proud of the technology that's been developed in Australia and is used right around the world unashamedly in other jurisdictions, and somehow we have decided that we're too good for it. I don't think Australians have truly understood the choice they're making, and that's our responsibility.
It's one of the issues I always find is that people don't have, if they live in the capital cities, they don't see a mine. They don't have any practical experience with it. And as I'm sure you know, if you go to the Brisbane airport early, it's predominantly high vis people heading off to
Yeah,
Moranbah, Wangkurra, and all these places, and the odd senator, in
yeah,
mixing amongst
yeah,
them. But then if you go at sort of 9 or 10 o'clock, completely different crowd. Like, and those people, I mean, do they know each other exists really? It's sort of two nations existing side by side. It's a
yeah.
challenge. Um,
It is a challenge, but interestingly, just to finish your excellent point, Dan, is that I think that the number of those people who are wearing suits going to Sydney or Melbourne or somewhere else,
mm,
if you scratched under, if Superman like they pulled open their suits, I bet they're wearing high vis underneath because they're paid for, if not
yeah,
directly, indirectly by mining.
yeah. There's been a lot of excited talk amongst federal politicians about the importance of the well, critical minerals, but also the rare earth sector in particular. And there's talk about some sort of potential deal between Australia and the United States so that we supply rare earths to stop the reliance that people have on China, who produces the majority of the rare earths. What's your understanding about the type of deal that could eventuate from those discussions?
I think this is really exciting because Australia is now only the second jurisdiction after Canada to be recognised in the supply chain for US defence. We know that the US economy is huge. They have allocated significant dollars towards critical minerals, both acquisition and processing. And that is the hardest thing for the Australian market is to achieve investment dollars. We have a very sophisticated ASX listing of mining companies, so it's not that we don't understand how to do it, we just don't have the dollars. And so the
Mm,
idea that we might be able to get that flow of investment from the US, from one of our great allies, I
mm,
think is really significant. And then if that means I think people who watch your podcast would understand that it's not that rare earths are rare, it's just that they're in small quantities and incredibly difficult and expensive to process. We need to lean on a partner for that processing capability as we develop the technology that means that we could do it onshore right here in Australia. So I think
mm,
this partnership with the US is incredibly important, one that we should be throwing our arms open and ensuring that our government to government connections and ambassadorial connections and our political connections are all very strong and well supported.
mm. And meeting them would be a good place to start. Hey,
Mm.
I understand Trump is not popular in Australia. Completely realistic about that. Some are blaming him in part for the recent federal election loss in Australia. But what lessons do you think can be learned by the centre right here in terms of policy changes, but also um, their political approach, which has yielded results, successful results over there in winning over states that were never thought possible to win, in moving the youth towards the GOP, in trends, in deep blue states like California and even parts of New York, which were considered completely off bounds in the past.
Well, my observation is that what Trump has done is he's been unashamedly pro-American. Now, that's not always great for the rest of us who trade or otherwise with the US, but for the US citizens, who doesn't want somebody who goes out and fights for you first?
Mm,
In Australia, what's our takeaway? Well, I think our young people are feeling disenfranchised by the system. They feel that they can't afford to buy a home. They feel that they're somehow being left out. I don't necessarily subscribe to that. I think that Australia has had a tradition of people going to the regions to make money, to build a family and a home, and that's okay. In fact, that's a great place to live and raise a family outside of
Mm,
the crush of the cities. So I think that we cannot rely on government to solve every problem. That we need to look at, are we making those opportunities well understood? But more importantly, is I just don't think that they feel that the major parties are fighting for them and have their best interests at
mm,
heart. I obviously disagree with that. That's why I've stood up for the coalition. That's why I'm a member of the National Party and the LNP here in Queensland, because I believe that we do have Australians' best interests at heart.
mm,
But once we have a huge part of the country who doesn't believe that, who is then voting for parties like the Greens or other non-government or parties that are never going to form government, then that's a real worry because they are not working in Australia's best interests. In fact, we've seen them mostly focused on what's happening in what's happening in Palestine. We've seen them
mm,
very focused on things that are just not true. Some of the
mm,
stories that are being made up that aren't in Australia's best interest. So,
mm.
I think that is something that Trump has been. He's a great communicator. Um, you know, so I think that that's what we need to do a better job of is making people understand we're fighting for their future prosperity and that of their children.
Yeah. Last couple of questions, Susie, because I know you're always short of time. Um, what do you think are the issues that will define the next federal election in Australia?
Oh, I think it will be a continuation of what we saw in the last term, which is this increasing shedding of jobs from the private sector. The federal government can only employ so many people using our taxes. So the shedding of jobs from the private sector, the increasing pressures on small business and bigger business, the impact of the potential closure of metals manufacturing and of mines, we are seeing exploration really drying up in this country because of the lack of confidence in approval processes. So I think they're the things that will start to play out. What is the government focused on? Well, they're focused on recognising Palestine, not standing up in Mount Isa, saying we will hold your hand and ensure that in the national interest we will continue to have a smelter in Mount Isa and a refinery in Townsville. We will meet our Australian demands first and then we'll meet our export commitments. That's I think will be the big issues that play out because Australians, as we saw during the last state election, it's about safety, economic safety, personal safety from crime. They want to know that their children have a place at a school and that they can get a bed in a hospital when they need to. These are not rocket science things, and they're the things that I think we need to be focused on.
Yeah. What about immigration too? Is that because there's sometimes I find there's a bit of a divide where in the city people uh, can see the consequences, and you get very tealish types in inner city Brisbane who will tell you sort of, okay, yes, this is something needs to be done about it. Obviously, they don't
Yeah.
want to be seen as mean by saying that, but they will tell you that. But sometimes in the regions where um, farmers need workers and all the rest of it, there's less of a concern, and sometimes they're in favour of big
Mm,
immigration as Australia. What do you think? How can that be kind of reconciled?
Yeah, you've identified it really well, and I think in the regions where we need workforce, is a really obvious example. But I went to a dry cleaner this week. You know, dry cleaners can't get staff.
Mm,
That you know, we every cafe that you go to, there is a young backpacker from some foreign country who is ensuring that I can get a cup of coffee. I don't think we understand how deeply we rely on both permanent and transient workforce who's willing to do jobs that Australians just aren't willing to do anymore. And so that immigration discussion, I think, is probably more around what is the sort of workforce that we need. So Australia has always been very generous in our migration from countries where, and I've just forgotten the term for it, Dan, when people are in conflict or
Asylum seekers, or is that,
asylum
yeah,
seekers and that sort of thing. We've done that, and I think the people who came from Vietnam 50 years ago are a great example of a very successful immigration program in that regard, because they were people who understood small business, families, working hard. You know, much like the Italians and the Scots and other waves of immigration we've had in past periods. We have to make sure that we focus on that kind of immigration, people who want to work and grow Australia and share our ideals of family and hard work and growing something, rather than people who aren't interested in learning our language or adopting our values, and certainly supporting women to be able to be free to live in our society uncovered and with all the same opportunities. That's right. So I think that we have to be more specific about what immigration means, and I welcome with open arms the generations of people and the people who are still coming, who want to work hard for their families to grow Australia, want to celebrate Australia. There should be more of that, and less people who want to celebrate the country that they came from and turn us into that country. That's not what we're about.
Final question, Susie. I mean, people, unless they know you probably don't appreciate your family's commitment to Northern Australia. You're from Cloncurry, but you've got family associations with Mount Isa mines and obviously the cattle industry and everything else. Yeah. Paint a positive picture for the future of North Queensland over the next 20 years.
What a great final question, because this is why I'm in this job. I believe in Australia, but particularly North Queensland and Northern Australia. It has got everything that we need to grow the region, to grow Australia's prosperity, to be a great trading partner. We have great agricultural soils. We have availability of water. We have terrific mining of minerals resources. We have the expertise. We just don't have the population. And so growing the infrastructure, growing the people and the populations is something that I wake up every day thinking about, how do we do more in that? How do I stand on the shoulders of the giants who've come before me, who saw that vision, who saw the plan for Northern Australia, and how it truly will make all Australians more prosperous, more secure. And if you haven't had a holiday in Northern Australia recently, I encourage you to come north, enjoy, everything that we've got to offer, and see the great opportunities, because most people who come to the north never leave.
Good place, and it grows good people.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks very much, Susie. I really appreciate it. I'll pop all your details in the show notes and stuff, and look forward to catching up in the near future. Cheers. Thanks again.
Hey, thanks for the time you take on examining these sort of issues. Thanks a lot, Dan.
See you, mate. Bye. Cool.